Hello and welcome back to Retro Ranger. Today we're going to take a look at the Parasite Eve series, which blends some interesting genres together, including traditional RPG, survival horror, and more. As a quick spoiler alert, we're going to cover the story of each game, and it's likely that we'll spoil some of the elements, but I'll do my best to steer clear of the biggest plot twists in case you want to find out for yourself. The series itself is rooted in a novel of the same name, which later turned into a manga series, and even a movie in Japan. The first two games of the series were released on the PlayStation 1, and the third came out over a decade after the previous installment for the PSP. By the time it came out, the others had already shipped over 3 million copies combined. I had missed out on these during their day in the sun, and only somewhat recently discovered them for myself. Are these games still approachable if you've never played them previously? Well, let's take a look and find out. As I mentioned, Parasite Eve is a unique blend of some genres, notably RPG and survival horror, the latter not being exclusive to the story either. Investigating areas and searching for clues, items, ammunition, and health refills are all definitely a focal point for this game, as is common in most survival horror games. Learning to conserve your ammo is also important, because you can run out and be forced to whack enemies with a club, opening yourself up to some dangerous situations. The game and story play out over 6 in-game days that split up the arc nicely and drives a well-put-together yet linear RPG-like story. You play as a police detective named Aya, or whatever you choose to name her, as you can enter the name in the opening sequence, as typical in most RPGs of the same generation. You start the adventure by taking in a nice opera. Only things quickly take a turn for the worst when spontaneous combustion breaks out in the middle of the performance, ruining any chance of a normal next few days for Aya. Eve, the main actress for the opera, whose real name is actually Melissa that you later find out, appears to be the reason behind this inferno, and so as a detective, you chase after her. Upon doing so though, you unexpectedly run into a little girl, Maya, for the first time as the story begins to seed itself. Over the course of the game, you begin to see Maya more and more as you visit different locations attempting to apprehend Eve. You begin to uncover a relationship between Aya, Maya, and Eve, as things aren't as disconnected as they first appear. After the first showdown with Eve, you and your partner Daniel, a typical buddy cop partner, travel to different locations investigating and learning about the motivations and plans of Eve, as well as trying to decipher her ramblings about mitochondria. It won't be long before Eve causes other people's mitochondria to go haywire, liquefying them and escalating her threat level. As the story progresses, Aya and Daniel befriend a Japanese scientist named Maida, who has some helpful information about a similar incident that happened in Japan. With the help of the scientist, they all learn that Aya and Eve's mitochondria each provide them with powers, though they do seem to be at odds with one another. Towards the latter half of the game, Eve steals sperm from the New York City hospital with the intent on birthing the ultimate being, something that Maida warns, if not obvious already, would be a very bad thing. You continue to chase Eve through various locations like the aforementioned hospital, a museum, sewers, and even City Park, battling wildlife and strange creatures affected by Eve's influence. By the dramatic end, you find yourself on Liberty Island to restore safety to New York and beyond. The gameplay itself definitely represents Squaresoft games in the 90s, with most of it taking place over traversing through pre-rendered backdrops with many interwoven CGI cutscenes. This isn't a bad thing, to be clear, but rather it makes it feel familiar and thus inviting. The CGI cutscenes are all well done and strategically move certain plot points forward, which would have been difficult to do within the game engine itself. While I do enjoy these scenes, they're not going to be for everyone, as they can get a bit gruesome. ESRB gave this an M for blood, gore, and violence, which likely felt right for the time when it was released, but it's by no means edgy compared to today's standard. While there are horror elements from a story and graphic standpoint, it's not likely to scare anyone today, and that's okay. The story is great and compelling as a thriller mystery. As I mentioned, the game unfolds in a linear fashion as you move from location to location, expanding and unlocking available ones as the game goes on. When you're at a location with hostile enemies, you encounter a pseudo-random battle like most turn-based RPGs of the time. I say pseudo-random because the more you play, the more you can see the pattern to which sections contain battles and which do not. The battles, once encountered, lock you into a section of the map where the fight breaks out and you can freely move Aya around the designated battle space, and move you should. The battle system is turn-based with an action timer that fills before you can select an action like attack, use an item, or use your PE or Parasite energy powers. Each enemy has their own action timer, though you can't see them, and they can attack you regardless of what you're doing, so constantly moving helps you avoid getting hit while you wait for your timer. When you win a battle, you gain experience points, which can allow you to level up, increasing your stats and max HP, and sometimes even learn new PE powers. In addition to XP, you can also get item drops like weapons, medicine, and other typical RPG stuff. Your main weapon will be some type of gun and has 3 core attributes: the attack power, the range, and how many bullets it will hold in its clip, all of which can be upgraded, but I'll talk about that shortly. When you attack, you choose your target or targets if your gun fires more than 1 bullet per turn, but you can also get a green hemisphere around you that indicates the range of that weapon, so it's best to pick something inside it. Failing to do so will net significantly reduce damage or an outright miss. Armor in the form of police vests work in a similar fashion with their own 3 primary attributes. Whether it's weapons or armor, you can acquire tools throughout the game that lets you upgrade a weapon or armor by plucking certain attributes from another like-type equipment at the cost of losing that attribute providing equipment piece. This system is great and it really adds some interesting strategies for how you play. I will say it was a bit unintuitive, so you'll likely blunder your way through a bit of it in the beginning, or I guess you could just read the in-game manual, but who has time for that? There are things to shoot and mysteries to solve. I also mentioned inventory management, and it's definitely an element from survival horror that came here too. Oftentimes you find yourself juggling items in crates to temporarily free up space like it's one giant puzzle. And while I get that giving unlimited space would likely make the game too easy, allowing you to carry tons of medicine and whatnot, it's still tedious and impedes way more than a game like Resident Evil, for instance. Luckily, there's the equipment manager Wayne to the rescue, who will take and store items like the needless old keys you acquire, junk, and more from you as you need.
Ultimately, Parasite Eve is a ton of fun. It's no stretch to call this game Final Fantasy meets Resident Evil, and it very much works here. I'm not sure where I was when this game came out originally, but I'm glad I circled back so many years later to catch up on what I was missing. It holds up well, and despite being a little bit more expensive today, you can grab it along with its sequel digitally on the PlayStation Store for the PS3, PSP, or Vita. If you've not played this one yet, do it. And don't worry, there's plenty of great story left to discover beyond what was covered here today. Let's move on to the next in the series, called Parasite Eve II.
Okay, 3 years have passed since the conclusion of the first game, and Aya's left the police force in favor of chasing down NMCs, or non-mitochondrial creatures, with the FBI and their new task force, MIST, the Mitochondrial Investigation and Suppression Team. Apparently coming up with acronyms was a big priority for their writing staff. There are some key differences between Parasite Eve and this sequel, and if I'm honest, they're mostly for the worst. One notable change is the controls of Aya herself. Locomotion is now a more strict version of tank controls, and instead of using L1 or R1 to turn, both turning and going straight or backward is via the left analog stick, and it's awkward at best. 2 hours in and I was still struggling here. While the original's controls left a bit to be desired, I'm actually surprised it got worse. The environments still have some pre-rendered backdrops, but there's much less than its predecessor. And while that sounds like an improvement, it does degrade the performance, causing lag. When combined with the static cams that have hard cut transitions and the new controls, it was disappointing to find spots where dodging enemies was much more difficult than what it should be. Speaking of enemies, the battle system has been converted from turn-based combat to pure action, and gone is your action timer. The targeting has been moved to the square button, where Aya needs to animate in real time to face her target before shooting, now tied to the R1 button, or else the shots will miss. PE powers retain a more turn-based feel, as pressing triangle brings up the powers menu to select which one to use, pausing gameplay. While I personally preferred the turn-based combat that felt like a unique collaboration with this genre, this now generic result is a serious letdown, especially when combined with the controls. The biggest issue with combat in this game is the camera. Too often are you running blindly into sections outside of the camera range to try and get some angle where you can see where the enemy is. It's mind-boggling how many times you fight an enemy that's just completely outside of your view. I just don't get the choice here to change out the battle system when this was the alternative. Also gone is the statistics of Aya, leveling up, upgradable weapon stats, all gone. You still get XP after battles, but you spend those points to get new PE powers or upgrade the ones you already have. Also earned in battles is BP, which is turned into different people to purchase weapons, armor, and items. Why they chose to tone down the RPG elements so significantly is a major mystery, and it's disappointing since the mashup was so refreshing and different. Another criticism is the CGI cutscenes, which the first game did so well, and they were fitting to the theme. This installment attempts to do the same, but it ends up being silly and just oftentimes cheesy. They're not all bad, to be clear, but ones that demonstrated transformations that really stood out in the last game are worse here. In fact, some of the enemies just look dumb. Look at this camel dog thing, for instance. With no leveling up, no clever story chapters, also gone by the way, you really lose a sense of progression, and with a strange sense, you just get strung along. The overall story isn't strong enough in the beginning to keep you, as you lack the sort of mystery that the original one had. In some cases, the story is just downright ridiculous. For example, there's a monster-infested and mostly deserted town that you're in at one point, and you find a rare survivor, Douglas, and he runs the local junkyard. During a conversation with him, you hear a scream from another survivor and see their house through the window, only due to the map layout, you need to go all the way around the map to get there. Once you're there, you hear the screaming again from behind a specific door, only it's locked. Apparently, breaking the door down or smashing an adjacent window is out of the question for an FBI agent, so you discover a hidden door in the room next door. Only it's bolted to the wall. Surely you break the door at this point, you say. Oh no, you need to go all the way back to Douglas, get his permission to use his tools, find his wrench, go all the way back again, casually unbolt the blocking bookcase, and finally make it inside. By some miracle, she's actually still alive. Ugh, so glad we did all that. I will say that as the game progresses, the story does come back around to tie into the original, which at least held me to the end to see how deep the connection went. Why it took more than half a game to get there, though, is beyond me. You meet some new characters, notably Kyle Madigan, a private investigator who befriends Aya as they share the same goal. Well, maybe. All complaints aside, there are some notable improvements as well that I did enjoy. There's more puzzles than the previous game, and that's a welcome change for sure to break up the straight combat march. Investigating your surroundings is a bit more interactive, as is the items that you pick up, requiring you to examine certain things before you can use them. Combat is no longer random battle encounters, but rather you can see them, well, usually anyways, ahead of the time. Moreover, you can just run away from encounters if you want to, at a slight penalty of losing 10 BP.
Overall, I found Parasite Eve II to be a bit of a disappointment. It's not a bad game, but after being so smitten with the first game, I guess my expectations got the better of me. Let's move on to the last game in our series titled The Third Birthday, in which they've had 10 years to figure out how to rekindle that magic. Let's take a look.
The Third Birthday is, as the time of making this video anyways, the final installment in the Parasite Eve series, making it a trilogy. Once again, you take control of Aya, who's received a bit of a makeover since we last saw her. While her appearance may have been upgraded, she's still up to her usual hobby, hunting down monsters. Only this time, she's back in New York and the monsters are called Twisted or Babbles this time around. As a result, Aya works for a new acronym, CTI, or Counter Twisted Investigation. One notable story element about how she does her hunting and investigations is that she actually goes back into the past, delving around dates of when the Twisted first appeared and ultimately destroyed the city. What allows her to go back in time is a new ability called Overdrive that, among time travel, provides some other benefits that we'll get into. Let's just get the controls out of the way first though, because that's the first thing that I was interested in after the last installment. I'm happy to report that the controls are likely the best of the three, though it does introduce a controllable camera and plays a lot like a third-person shooter, so perhaps that's not a fair comparison. While I still pine for the turn-based combat of the original, this action combat is at least well implemented, and it remains enjoyable. Gone are the cheap hits and the hidden enemies from the second game, thank God. Better yet, some more great things come back from the original game as well. Customizing your weapons is again a thing. Bringing in BP from the second game, you can actually use this as currency to buy new weapons or upgrade existing. Upgrading works differently and more intuitively than the original, but it's a bit more on rails, so take your pick I guess. I'm just glad that there was some level of upgrades here. Also making a return is levels for both Aya and her weapons, providing some feeling of progression. Speaking of progression, the story unfolds over 7 explicit episodes. Clearly the development team agreed that the original game was where it was at. A new addition is the ability to customize Aya's stats using OE, or Over Energy. While on missions, you automatically collect OE chips, which can be inserted into this interesting 3x3 grid, allowing for different stat combinations and enhancements. As I mentioned, combat is action-based and in third-person view. Control during the battle is fluid, and the tediousness of switching weapons is solved. Ammo is still, for the most part, finite, but there is a handgun default that has unlimited bullets, so it's less of a survival feel in that regard. Oftentimes it's during combat that the overdrive ability takes shape, as it allows you to dive into an available ally and take control of them, similar to the mechanic of going back into the past where you dive into a starting ally. You can switch at any time that are within range to another ally, and you can only truly die if all allies, including the one you're in, die, or if you fail to switch to a new ally once your current one dies, though the time to do so is rather generous. A lot of the combat focus is on leveraging your replenishing band of allies and either coordinating crossfire attacks or bouncing between them to get a better vantage point, or the more often sacrificing the source ally to get some benefit. There's also Liberation Mode, which is basically a temporary frenzy mode that lets Aya move faster and deal more damage. I think they should have named this mechanic Overdrive instead, as it feels more applicable, but hey, it's not my game. Beyond switching to other allies, Overdrive can also be used as an attack by diving into an enemy and exploding them from the inside, doing typically massive damage and usually killing them for non-boss enemies. This combat tactic is only available when a yellow triangle appears, so it's best to keep an eye out for it at all times. Visually, this game is great and it runs without noticeable lag. While the PSP typically has some rough loading times, you can actually choose to install the game from the UMD in the main menu, which makes loads super quick, and I highly recommend it if you have the space. The CGI cutscenes are great, and nothing looks cheesy at all.
I'm alive?
What's not so great is the lack of puzzles. There are none. The whole genre has changed from the others in the series, and it's basically combat from start to finish, only broken up by cutscenes and a hub world where you prepare for your next mission. You don't really investigate anything in the sense of the previous games, and you never collect any items. It's definitely a different feel, for better or worse. As I mentioned, Aya's goal is to go back in time to prevent the disaster using CTI's Overdrive system after discovering Aya's ability to dive. When CTI first discovered Aya, she had lost her memory from amnesia, and with each completed mission, she begins to remember her past. And these are usually playing out through the cutscenes between levels. Throughout the game, she meets various people from previous installments, like Kyle Madigan from the second game, and Maida, the Japanese scientist from the first game, and they actually help uncover the mysteries of the Twisted. Like any good mystery, corruption is afoot, and it turns out that the leader of the CTI himself is involved. When the origin of the monsters is fully understood, the finale and resolution is a worthy conclusion to the series, and it's one that I'm not going to spoil. I don't mean to trim out all the story details from this last installment, but it really is where most of the spoilers would happen, so I'll refrain from delving any deeper. Suffice it to say though that while there are some story elements that seem somewhat disconnected at first, its conclusion is worth the playthrough.
Okay, and overall, I enjoyed the third birthday for the most part, despite that it has a very drastic change in feel. I still prefer the original game the best, but perhaps if I had played them each when they came out instead of the back-to-back that I just did, the contrast wouldn't have been so noticeable either. Either way, we've not received another entry in this series, but the fanbase continues to clamor for another continuation, and it's one that I would certainly welcome. Have you played any from the series? If so, which one do you guys like the best? Let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, thank you for watching Retro Ranger.